The sun hung low over the Arizona territory, casting long shadows across the desert floor as James Carter guided his horse along the narrow canyon trail. He'd been tracking a lost steer for hours, and the failing light told him he'd need to make camp soon. The autumn air carried a chill that promised a cold night ahead, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the plaintive howl of wolves beginning their evening hunt. James was a solitary man by nature, preferring the company of his horse and the vast open spaces to the crowded saloons and gossip of town. He'd come west 3 years ago, leaving behind a life that no longer fit him, seeking something he couldn't quite name in the endless horizons and star-filled skies. He'd found work on the Patterson Ranch, earned the trust of hard men through harder work, and carved out a small piece of this wild country for himself. The howling grew closer, more urgent, and something in the tone made James pull his horse to a stop. These weren't the lazy calls of wolves communicating across distance. These were hunting cries, excited and hungry. He'd heard that sound before, and it never ended well for whatever creature had drawn their attention. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle secured to his saddle as he urged his mount toward the source of the commotion. As he crested a rocky outcrop, James saw them. A pack of 5 wolves circled a young woman who stood with her back against a boulder, a broken branch held before her like a weapon. She wore traditional Apache dress, the fringed buckskin torn and dusty from what must have been a desperate flight. Her long black hair had come loose from its braids, falling wild around her shoulders. Even from this distance, James could see the defiance in her stance, the way she refused to cower despite the impossible odds. Without thinking, James raised his rifle and fired into the air. The sharp crack echoed through the canyon, and the wolves scattered momentarily, confused by this new threat. He fired again, this time kicking up dirt near the largest wolf, a gray beast with calculating yellow eyes. The pack retreated several yards but didn't flee entirely. They were too hungry, too committed to their prey. James dismounted quickly, keeping his rifle trained on the wolves as he moved toward the woman. She watched him approach with the same wariness she'd shown the wolves, her dark eyes assessing this new variable in her survival equation. He could see now that she was young, perhaps 20, with high cheekbones and skin the color of desert sand. Blood stained her left arm where teeth or claws had found their mark. "Get behind me," James said, gesturing with his free hand while keeping his eyes on the circling pack. The woman didn't move. He tried again in the limited Apache phrases he'd learned from an old ranch hand, butchering the pronunciation but conveying enough meaning. She shifted slightly, moving to position herself where she could still fight if needed, but allowing James to place himself between her and the wolves. The gray wolf, clearly the pack leader, paced back and forth, weighing its options. James could see the calculation in those predatory eyes. The wolf was considering whether this new prey was worth the risk, whether the hunger in its belly outweighed the danger of the man with the thundering stick. James fired again, closer this time, and the decision was made. The pack turned and loped away into the gathering darkness, though James suspected they wouldn't go far. He kept his rifle ready, watching the shadows for several long minutes before finally turning to face the woman. She stood tall despite her obvious exhaustion and injury, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. There was something ancient and knowing in that gaze, as if she could see straight through to whatever truth he carried in his bones. "You're hurt," James said, nodding toward her bloodied arm. She glanced down at the wound as if noticing it for the first time, then back at him. When she spoke, her English was clear and unaccented, catching him off guard. "It is not deep." The wolves were more interested in intimidation than killing quickly. "They wanted me to run, to tire myself out." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "You speak Apache like a child learning his first words." Despite the situation, James felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. Never claimed to be good at languages. "Name's James Carter. I work at the Patterson Ranch about 8 miles south of here." "I know the Patterson Ranch. I am Aita." She lowered the branch she'd been holding, letting it fall to the ground. "My people's land borders the southern edge of Patterson's cattle range. We have an understanding with him. He does not push his fences into our territory, and we do not push his cattle off cliffs." James knew the arrangement she spoke of, though he'd never encountered any of the Apache who lived in the region. Patterson had spoken of them with respect, unusual for a white rancher in this territory. He'd said they'd been there long before any settlers arrived and would likely be there long after, so it was better to live as neighbors than enemies. "What were you doing out here alone?" James asked, scanning the darkening landscape. "Those wolves are still out there, and night's coming fast." Aita's expression hardened. "I was tracking a mountain lion that killed 2 of our goats. I followed it further than I intended and lost the trail. When I turned back, the wolves had picked up my scent." She looked at him directly, unflinching. "I would have survived without your help, but your intervention was timely. For that, you have my gratitude." James had no doubt she would have tried to survive, but he'd seen what wolf packs could do to full-grown men with weapons. Still, he recognized the pride in her words and knew better than to argue. "We should get moving. My camp is about a mile from here. You can rest there tonight, and I'll take you back to your people in the morning." "No." The word was soft but absolute. Aita stepped closer to him, and in the fading light, he could see the strange intensity in her eyes. "You saved my life. Among my people, this creates a bond. A debt that cannot be easily dismissed." James shifted uncomfortably. "You don't owe me anything. Any decent person would have done the same. But they did not. You did." She moved closer still, so close he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "In my culture, when someone preserves your life, a part of your spirit becomes connected to theirs. You did not just save my body from the wolves. You preserved my future, all the days I have yet to live, all the things I have yet to do. That is not a small thing." James didn't know what to say to that. He'd grown up in Boston, in a world of rigid social codes and unspoken rules, but nothing in that life had prepared him for this moment. He could feel the weight of something significant happening, something that went beyond a simple rescue, but he couldn't quite grasp its shape. Aita reached out and touched his face, her palm warm against his weathered cheek. "You're mine now," she said simply, as if stating an obvious truth. "As I am yours. This is the way of it." The words should have frightened him, should have sent him backing away with polite refusals and explanations of misunderstanding. Instead, James felt something settle in his chest, a rightness he couldn't explain. He thought of the emptiness that had driven him west, the sense that something essential was missing from his life. Standing in this desert canyon with this Apache woman's hand on his face, he felt that emptiness begin to fill. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice rougher than intended. "You will," Aita replied. She lowered her hand but didn't step away. "For now, we should go to your camp. Tomorrow, I will take you to my village. You will meet my family, and we will begin to navigate what this bond means." James wanted to protest, to explain that he couldn't just abandon his duties at the ranch, that he had a life and responsibilities. But looking at Aita standing in the gathering darkness, proud and certain, he found he didn't want to protest at all. Something had shifted in the moment he'd fired that first shot, some invisible line had been crossed, and there was no going back to who he'd been before. They made their way to his campsite in silence, James leading his horse while Aita walked beside him. He built a fire while she tended to her wound, cleaning it with water from his canteen and strips of cloth he provided. The wolves howled in the distance, but they didn't approach. The fire and human presence were enough to keep them at bay. As darkness settled fully over the desert, James and Aita sat across the fire from each other, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. He found himself studying her, this woman who had declared he belonged to her with such certainty. There was a strength in her that went beyond physical capability, a core of something unbreakable that he recognized because he tried to forge the same thing in himself. "Why aren't you afraid?" Aita asked suddenly. Most white men would be uncomfortable with an Apache woman in their camp. They would worry about war parties or treachery. James considered the question carefully. "I suppose I've learned that fear of what you don't understand leads to missing what's actually in front of you. You're not some symbol of your people any more than I am of mine. You're just Aita, and right now that's all that matters." Something softened in her expression, a crack in the armor of certainty she wore. "You are strange for a cowboy. Most I have encountered speak of Indians as if we are one creature with one mind. They do not see individuals. Most cowboys I've met are fools, James said, earning a genuine smile from Aida. It transformed her face, making her seem younger and lighter. He found himself wanting to see that smile again. They talked through the night, sharing stories of their lives. James spoke of Boston and his family's disappointment when he'd chosen the West over the law practice they'd planned for him. Aida told him of growing up between two worlds, her people trying to maintain their traditions while adapting to the reality of settlers and soldiers. She spoke of her mother's wisdom and her father's pragmatic acceptance that the old ways were changing. As dawn broke over the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of gold and red, James realized that everything had indeed changed. This woman, this moment, had become a turning point he couldn't have anticipated. When Aida stood and announced it was time to go to her village, he didn't hesitate. He packed his camp, mounted his horse, and followed her into the desert. Whatever came next, he knew one thing with certainty. His life as a solitary cowboy was over. He belonged to Aida now, just as she'd said. And strangely, wonderfully, he found he didn't mind at all.